to this strange and malleable world of imperialists, revisionists, dogmatists, sectarians, and Zionists. I can't do without this. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No, not yet. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank, of course, the organizers for the invitation to this conference, and I'm honored to speak in front of so many distinguished scholars in the history of Jews and the history of anti-Semitism. Misha has asked me to provide a wider framework of Eastern European history in this period between 45 and 68, especially with a focus on concepts of enemies and the communist conceptual world in general. And I understood this also as a task to raise some issues about the concepts of enemies and the communist conceptual world in general. And I understood the tendencies of the epoch. So I apologize again that I'm, going to talk more about anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, more than the Jewish experience. So now, what is my angle on the subject? I'm not an expert in Jewish history, as you know. My own work has not been directly focused on the history of anti-Semitism, but I have come across these questions in my research on the communist mentalities in post-war East Central Europe. Particularly, I was interested in the shift that occurred around 1956 from Stalinism to what I called Post-Stalinism, a shift from the radical and fast transformation of the society to something new. A couple of speakers have already touched upon the issue of 1956. For me, this is the very center, the gravitation point of the post-war Eastern and perhaps general European history. Instead of seeing the de-Stalinization of 1956 as the beginning of the end of communism, as the great French historian François Furet put it, himself a former communist and even Stalinist, I have suggested that we should conceive of 56 as a beginning of a new system of legitimacy which rested on new narratives. In my view, the communist utopianism did not disappear altogether, but rather transformed in a process that I called a shift from programmatic to processual utopia. And I draw here on thinkers from that very time, like Ernst Bloch, Zygmunt Bauman, and also Michal Pullmann. In this transformation, people invested less confidence in large visions of future and instead resorted to processual improvement of the existent arrangements. For instance, from revolution to reform, from ideology to expertise, and so on. It's a very simplified version, but I think we can work with that. The most important effect of these changes on the rank-and-file communist imagination, in my work I was focusing especially on the local and regional level of the party. The most important effect on these people was the growing sense of ambivalence and uncertainty about the future, even confusion and lack of clarity. That's a concept that crops up after 1956 and is then massively used in the propaganda everyday life. Ideologische Unklarheiten, ideologické nejasnosti, etc. I call this arrangement a questioning kind of discourse, which is different from Stalinism, where much less questions were asked during the party meetings. My principal sources are party meetings minutes. And it is also within this transformation that I would like to explore here the concepts of enemy as one of the key identity-building aspects of communist mentality of the time. And within this, I would like to look at the role of anti-Semitism/anti-Zionism within this shift. And the goal is to introduce more chronological dynamics into these changes of concepts like anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, first, a couple of words about the concept of enemy. It is a commonplace to say that all political communities need concepts of enemies to consolidate their unity. The post-war European communism, culminating in its Stalinist form, developed a particularly radical narrative of enmity, and indeed, Stalinism corresponds well to Carl Schmitt's well-known definitions of politics as dividing world into friend and foe. Yet the question for me as historian is how can we capture the change of enemy concepts over time, particularly in such a tumultuous period like the post-war Eastern Europe. For this purpose, I found the typology suggested by the political scientist Rodney Barker useful. Barker identifies 4 points on a scale of enmity images running from first simple competition through second antagonism to third enmity and eventually to fourth a demonizing hostility that entails the advocacy of extermination of entire categories of people. And it is in this variation of enmity narratives that we see in the communist imagination, the communist imagination between 1945 and 1968. This diversification also enables us to capture the key issue related to the anti-Semitism in communist states. Namely, how do images and narratives shape political action? And for our post-war time, under political action, I understand especially that connected with war, both conducting and preventing, and other kinds of physical violence. At this point, we should return to Schmitt, but we should not stay at his idea of friend and foe, division. What matters for us now is Schmitt's idea that the concept of enemy is intrinsically connected with mortal combat. That is, the usage of physical violence with the end to kill the enemy. Schmitt writes in the concept of the political, quote, "It does not mean competition, nor does it mean pure intellectual controversy, nor symbolic wrestling in which, after all, every human being is somehow always involved. For it is a fact that the entire life of a human being is a struggle, and every human being symbolically a combatant. The friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning, precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing." End of quote. Following Schmitt, we should take the post-war period literally as a time which was still defined by war, by overcoming it, forgetting it, or by starting it again. Violence has remained in the center of political reasoning of that period, at least until 1970s, and I would argue even 1989, when we consider, for instance, precisely the non-violent character of the so-called peaceful revolutions. Now, my second point, let us now briefly summarize the major changes in the communist enmity narratives between Stalinist and post-Stalinist period. And I have to say that this is really a very schematic, simplified version. In Stalinism, the images of the enemy epitomized an absolute hostility, at the end of which was the physical annihilation of the enemy, quite in the Schmittian sense. This included both the total warfare against the external enemy, such as fascism in the World War II and imperialism in the Cold War, and the annihilation of the internal enemy. Above the latter, the Stalinists designed narratives of total dehumanization. One quote, in his infamous speech on the defects in party work and measures for liquidating Trotskyists and other double dealers from 1937, Joseph Stalin attacked the Trotskyists who were, I quote, "a frenzied and unprincipled band of wreckers, diversionists, spies and killers acting upon the instructions of the intelligence service organs of foreign states." End of quote. A final destruction of the enemy must be the actual goal of party politics. I have a couple of other quotations from the Kratky Kurs. It was already mentioned, but I have to leave it out. In contrast, in post-Stalinism, the concept of the enemy was relativized. The enemy ceased to be a fixed, absolute, demonized enemy element that was to be physically destroyed. The enemy had to be steadily reinterpreted. That's, in my view, the most important shift after 1956. The enemies they lose their unambivalent, unambiguous meaning. This was mainly because the post-Stalinist narrative of enmity had to combat the false images of Stalinism. Indeed, Khrushchev, in his secret speech, targeted Stalin's alleged abuse of the enemy's argument. I mean, Khrushchev actually uses in secret speech the concept of enemy only in the negative terms, as a critical tool against Stalin, which changes the semantics of the word and then of the concept of the enemy, crucially. Khrushchev rejected the concept of enemy of the people on the grounds that Stalin had exploited many times for his purposes. Another example, the Polish communist leader Gomułka reinterpreted the enemy in a similar way. Like Khrushchev, he rejected the Stalinist fabrication of enemies, but went even further by questioning the mere possibility that any enemies could have ever influenced the course of socialism in Poland. Gomułka made it clear when talking about the Poznań workers' uprising of June 1956, I quote, "There can always and everywhere be and act agents and provocateurs, but never and nowhere can they determine the attitude of the Polish working class." End of quote. It was a political naivety, Gomułka said, that the Stalinists clumsily tried to portray the tragedy of Poznań as the work of imperialist agents. Thus, when Gomułka talked about enemies, I have to say enemies and traitors in this way really, like Khrushchev, he usually put them in quotation marks as examples of Stalinists' enemy construction. So in other words, the post-Stalinists could not talk about enemies in such an easy way because there was already a very difficult prehistory how enemies were talked about by the Stalinists. So it is a sort of internal communist coming to terms with the own past, also regarding how the concept of enemy was used. After 1956, there was a major change also in how enemies were depicted. While the Stalinist enmity narratives were directed primarily against concrete, personal opponents who personalized the hostile doctrines, since the late 50s, since post-Stalinism, the enemy was often abstracted and equated with hostile ideologies. American imperialism rather than Eisenhower or Kennedy. Revisionism rather than concrete persons like Tito, Slansky or Reich. Dogmatism and personality cult rather than Stalin. Veriovština rather than Beria. The enemy imagination of post-Stalinism demonized the enemy less often as living monsters. Instead, enemy was abstracted as an opposing system. How about the compositions of enemies? The post-Stalinist narrative of enmity re-evaluated the already existing enemies, which included the Imperialists, the West Germans, the Zionists, and the Church. Yet at the same time, there were important innovations. The Revisionists, the Dogmatists, the personality cult, and later also the mutual aversions between East Central European peoples, between Poles and Czechs, between Czechs and Slovaks, Slovaks and Hungarians, or Hungarians and Romanians, and of course, all hated the Russians. But also, it has to be said that the national animosities seldom grew from competition to enmity. So it was rather low on the scale of enmity narratives. These new enemy images were complicated Also because the overall political situation was constantly changing. We have already touched upon these turning points very often during this day. The rapprochement with Yugoslavia in 1955, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, 56, the Hungarian uprising, and the subsequent conservative offensives. In the 60s, we have the 1961 Berlin crisis, 62 Cuba crisis, Khrushchev's fall in 64, and of course, the crisis year of 1968, with events in Poland and Czechoslovakia. So what we have is a dense sequence of turning points. I found one this morning, and a nice quotations showing how these confusions were debated or how they were reflected upon in local space. It's a quote by Comrade Gutmann at the party meeting in Poland, Katowice, on the 12th October 1956. Tito zawsze kojarzył mi się z toporem i niedawno od towarzysza Bułganina dowiedziałem się, że towarzysz Tito to leninowiec. Ja myślę, że od kata z toporem do leninowca jest duży skok. Trochę za duży. So, I have always associated Tito with an axe. And recently, from Comrade Bulganin, I learned that Comrade Tito is a Leninist. I think that from hangman to the Leninist, it is a big leap, a bit too big. So, you can find hundreds of thousands such a confusions, lacks of clarity on the local and regional party level. They followed by vast sequences of questions. No, I don't understand. Could you explain? There's a sort of way of discourse that absolutely dominates the aftermath of 1956, but actually is established then for the entire 1960s. In line with this instability, the enmity language was gradually losing the unambiguous Stalinist clarity. Also, it lost much of its effectiveness after its ability to turn hate words into actual physical violence diminished. Persecution continued, of course, after 56. The intellectuals in the GDR, the Harichgruppe, the church in Czechoslovakia, the students in Poland in the late 1960s. And one interesting thing that often is forgotten, that still 50s and the 60s, the most repressed and persecuted social group in communist regimes was the working class. It's in absolute numbers, it was incomparable with other social groups like students or intelligentsia. But overall, the notion of peaceful coexistence prevailed, both within the society and in international relations. So, instead of Stalinist black and white images, we see here a complex network of enemy attributions in which several aspects of enmity collide, such as Zionism and Jewish nationalism, revisionism, anti-German aversion, or the repulsion towards intellectuals. Since 1957, a conservative reaction to 56, the new chief enemy was that of revisionism, a multi-layered image that fluctuated between external and internal enemy. Zionism was an equally elastic concept, capable to absorb both national and non-national elements. Darek Stola showed in his work this in regard to Polish 1968. The Zionist could adopt diverse and often contradictory meanings. It could be Jewish nationalist, but also uprooted cosmopolitan, Stalinist, as well as agents of imperialism. It is also through the lens of this ambivalence of the concepts like revisionism and Zionism we should read the complex problematic of 1967-1968, anti-Zionism in Eastern Bloc. In the last part of my paper, I would like to demonstrate this briefly on 3 examples. given I'm really not an expert in anti-Zionist campaigns 67, 68. First, there is no doubt that there were strong expressions of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or anti-Semitic anti-Zionism in Poland in 1968. Yet a closer inspection of the debates on local party level reveals how unclear these concepts actually were. For instance, I have investigated the disciplinary action in the Voivodship Wrocław with a younger philosopher, Václav Maybaum, who was accused of both Zionism and revisionism. The party cell could not come to any conclusion as to what Maybaum actually was. Particularly, the concept of Zionism was understood in a manifold way. And you know what is really striking? The minutes, if you get in the archive certain files, you know, of the party meetings minutes, some of them are like this, but now it turns like this. I mean, there was really debate of also some of the minutes. Some of the meetings took 2 days. The minutes might have 200 to 300 pages. It's a really, and also there are these remarks, comrades spoke frankly, which became a commonplace already after 1956, but 68 again, it is used very often. One of the party members in Wrocław said, I quote, "I cannot judge whether he should, Maybaum, be classified as Zionist or revisionist. One thing is clear to me, namely that in the course of a rigid and schematic classification of party work, one should not moderate the fight against foreign ideologies, including the Zionists. That someone is not a Jew does not prove that he does not use the poison of Zionist propaganda against the party." End of quote. The Wrocław plenary debate shows that the enemy image of Zionism and its relationship to revisionism was anything but uniform and clear. While the discussion of anti-Zionism was marked by misunderstandings, consensus finally emerged in favor of the dominating role of revisionism as the principal enemy. The real enemy is revisionism, Zionism is a secondary one. Even though also no one really understood what the revisionism is. And there was also the same debate about this concept. Second example, we see a similar ambiguity in the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign in the aftermath starting with aftermath of the Six Days War, starting with 1967. I draw here on the work by a young Norwegian historian, Asmund Gjerde, who analyzed not only published material of the Soviet campaign, but also the archive of the propaganda department. Gjerde came to the conclusion that the campaign was fueled by a genuine belief of Soviet ideologues in an all-embracing anti-Soviet imperialist conspiracy, of which Zionism was only a partial aspect. He is not arguing that there was no anti-Semitism in Soviet anti-Zionism, or that it could not kindle more openly anti-Semitic sentiments. But the explanation of its anti-Semitic features should be more complex than merely seeing Soviet anti-Zionism as a disguised form of traditional anti-Semitism, cynically using it to achieve political ends. Third, after speaking of Poland and Soviet Union, I will conclude my talk by revisiting my home country, Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring of 1968 occurred in parallel to the anti-Zionist campaign in other countries, which raises some questions. In his recent monograph, German historian Martin Schulze-Wesser described the Prague Spring not only as an endeavor to come to terms with the Stalinist past. At the same time, Schulze-Wessel argues, the Prague Spring was an attempt by the Czech society to deal with its own anti-Semitic specters, whether from the Slansky trial or even older from the Second Republic of 1938 and 39 and the German occupation. The reformers, some of them Czech Jews, saw anti-Semitism as the quintessence of the anti-democratic potential of society. It's quite a strong argument, but for instance, the action program of the party, the most important document of the Prague Spring from April 1968, declares, I quote, "The party will fight against anti-Semitism, racism, and all anti-humanist ideologies." I think these three concepts altogether next to each other is an interesting combination. Anti-Semitism, racism, and all anti-humanist ideologies. Schulze-Wessel raises the provoking question of why in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and unlike in Poland, anti-Semitism failed to gain support. There were actually better preconditions in Czechoslovakia, given the massive wave of anti-Semitism that laced the Slansky trial. In fact, in 1968, only a marginal, small group of intellectuals, like the mentioned Eduard Goldstücker, who was receiving the so-called red mail, an anti-Semitic late Stalinist denunciations. Gustav Husák, later the leader of the post-1968 normalization, tried to exploit anti-Semitism in Slovakia. But most of the society, obviously, did not accept anti-Semitism. Schulze-Wessel, perhaps in a slightly too optimistic way, explains this reluctance by the fact that the Czechoslovak public, especially the cultural production, began to critically deal with the Holocaust memory already in the early 1960s, cinema and literature. So I think this comparison, however, at the first sight, looks strange between the Polish and Czechoslovak case. I think it triggers interesting questions, especially about the timing. And I was just chatting with Katerina about that, and she told me her interpretation would be that precisely because the Czechs sort of, lived through their anti-Semitism 15 years or 16 years earlier, there was no need after that. And precisely the opposite was the case in Poland. As Darek said, there was no Slansky trial in Poland at that time. That's why this delay. Are we satisfied with this explanation? Obviously we're not. I mean, it's a good starting point, but future historians should dig deeper, obviously. Nevertheless, the fact that anti-Semitism probably did find a certain amount of response in the society is also evidenced by the ease with which it returned in the communist propaganda in the 1970s. I'm not, again, an expert about that, but we can mention the return of the critique of anti-Zionism in the public media, the harassment of the Jewish community, or also some anti-Zionist / anti-Semitic traits of the campaign against the Charter 77, especially against František Kriegel, who was both an actor of the Prague Spring 1968 and then later the Charter 77. These examples provide evidence for how unstable and recurrent the enemy concepts, and especially Zionism, were in state socialism. What we see is rather a steady shifting between the various forms of enmity whose contents could be always changed and had to be changed. This unstable nature of the communist images of enemy raises the question, which is crucial for us historians of communist dictatorships, as to whether they stabilized or rather destabilized the communist rule, or whether they do stabilize or destabilize any modern rule at all. For East Central Europe under communism, we might conclude that despite their unstable and abstract nature, the concepts of enemy contributed to the consolidation of socialist systems for a considerable long time. However, as Potsdam historian Martin Zabro put it in an article on concepts of enemy in the GDR, it was always precaire Stabilisierung, a precarious stabilization, given the dual nature of these images as both repulsive, yet at the same time uncannily attractive. This raises my last question, namely that of continuity. Professor Gross spoke yesterday about the persistence of Polish anti-Semitism until the present day. He made this big leap from Piłsudski and the post-war anti-Jewish violence, hopla, to the current government and the politica historyczna. Even though he discussed neither 68 nor the long period from the 1970s to 1990s, which I think we should evermore treat as a unity, he implicitly postulated a continuity of one particular kind of anti-Semitism. This alleged continuity should be taken under close scrutiny. For instance, what was the meaning of 1989 in all this? It is striking, perhaps it's not striking, but I found it striking this morning. It is striking that neither anti-Semitism but nor anti-Semitism did emerge during the peaceful revolutions of 1989, as far as I can tell as a contemporary. That was not an issue. The calls for non-violence, however, made clear that the language of enmity for some time was not desired. I stress for some time, since, as we know now, the then fascination with democracy and human rights appears rather as a mere phase that is now coming to an end. All new pictures of enemy are looming, but I suggest that we should read them as differentiated, multi-layered, and contextualized as I try to read the enemy concepts of post-war communism. Thank you very much.
Gibbard is first on the list.
Thank you very much for a fascinating and very clear presentation. I'd like to complicate matters slightly. First of all, I think that the crucial element in the communist formation of the concept of the enemy is 3941. There was an almost magical attempt to transform an enemy to an ally overnight. And it was believed in by the authors of the transformation. And then the ally turns out to have been an enemy all along. Not only that, but actually a worse enemy than communist propaganda ever could have claimed. I mean, the real horrors committed by the Nazis were worse than whatever accusations Stalin could have launched at the international Hitlerite, Pilsudskiite, Zionist, Japanese plot. The enemy was real. And I agree with you that the turning point is the mid-50s. But I think that it's not only the death of Stalin, it's also the Soviet age bomb. guaranteed that the Soviet Union cannot be overrun as it almost had been. The enemy doesn't change his nature. He would love to destroy socialism. He just can't. There is an objective barrier, a shield protecting socialism. Therefore, although the objective, the threat to socialism is still there, it's simply contained. What could work, the only thing that could work, is the enemy within. But how could there be an enemy within if we represent the genuine interests of the working class, the peasantry, the progressive intelligentsia, or practically everybody except the capitalists, but they're dead? The very idea is perverse. And it takes a perverse movement to express the perverse idea. Zionism fits the bill beautifully. From a communist perspective, it's incomprehensible. It's not only evil and rotten, it doesn't make sense. What is the class interest that bonds a tailor from Vitebsk and the Rothschilds and Moshe Dayan, right? And please, this is ridiculous. And yet people are willing to go to jail for it, or possibly die for it. It's a perverse Protean enemy that incarnates everything that could threaten us from within. This is why it becomes useful, because it doesn't make sense. But there is a paradox in all that. Until communists started using anti-Semitism as a major instrument, the situation was pretty clear. If you were anti-communist, you were also anti-Semitic, because communism is horrible and has been brought to us by the Jews. If you were anti-Semitic, you were also anti-communist, because the horrible Jews have brought us communism. And then comes the crucial turning point in Poland in '68, when the communists become anti-Semitic. So what do you, a good anti-communist, do? If you remain anti-Semitic, you find yourself on their side of the barricade. This is when this paradox broke the utility of the usage of anti-Semitism as a destructive tool, because since the communists are anti-Semitic themselves, anti-Semitism can't be as good as we thought it is. It becomes compromised and delegitimized. And I think that those two elements, the experience that there actually is a real enemy out there willing to slaughter millions of people, something we've accused the capitalists of wanting to do but never really believed. And then the experience of World War II proves it can actually happen. And only the H-bomb is a guarantee against that. And this complicated item of anti-Semitism, which first fits the bill exactly, and then returns to haunt those who use it, because it creates conditions for the coalescence of another coalition, which this time eventually can really become a threat. And I can't resist this, I'm sorry, this is just a footnote, but there's this anecdote which most beautifully expresses the pernicious nature of the enemy. It's a Polish jail in '51, and 3 prisoners meet. They don't recognize each other, so they ask, "Oh, what are you in for?" "Oh, I've been arrested for opposing the correct policies of Comrade Gomułka in '47. And you?" "Well, I've been arrested for supporting the erroneous policies of Comrade Gomułka in '49. "Oh, and you?" "Not Gomułka."
I think we can correct.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And we have Jan Behrendt.
Yeah, this fits maybe a little bit. I was going to say similar things. I mean, I agree with most of your argument, Pavel, about the differences between Stalinism and the more vegetarian period afterwards, where the Schmittianism is not quite as obvious, at least, as in Stalinism. But some more general points, maybe. communist rule, I would argue from 1917 to 1991, you have at least
Yes.
the Soviet Union, you have the besieged fortress mentality the whole time, you never back away from maybe in the last years of Gorbachev somehow,
But it's,
you know, so
it's changing.
You always need the enemy in some way.
Yes.
You need it again today under Putin, so there's a lot of continuity there. And then when it comes to Stalinism, I also think it's a little more complex because I don't see a stable enemy under Stalinism either, because you have, you know, the Social Democrats who can be your best friends at the People's Front, but they can be worse than fascism a couple of years after or before. You know, 1939 to 41 we already talked about. Hitler all of a sudden becomes an ally. Or what I looked at in my dissertation is also very interesting. In 1949, when the Polish-German friendship is declared, actually, because the GDR is founded and the Germans are not enemy anymore, but are now supposed to be friends of People's Poland, and you get all the same stuff in the party meetings, even under Stalin, where people are like, I can't believe this. The Germans are now supposed to be our friends. You gotta be kidding, right? I mean, so what's more important than the, or let's put it this way, it's a very instrumental use of the concept of the enemy, even under Stalinism. What it's, in the end, what it's about, it's your loyalty to the party to believe that even the latest turn, you know, is right, although it doesn't make any sense to you, sort of like, at all. The larger question that we may ask is, you know, what is specifically communist about this whole thing? Because of course other ideologies and governments also use the concept of the enemy, and European culture is inherently anti-Semitic for hundreds of years. This is not an invention of communism at all. And I think, you know, what would help us is also the use under communism of concepts that were developed in the 19th century or probably sometimes even older, that are then used by the communists in a very eclectic way, especially then also, but also under Stalinism, but also late socialism, national myth, and so on, national enemies. I mean, all this, what you talked about, you know, Slovaks don't like Hungarians, blah, blah, blah. Of course, all of this is much older also than communism, and what is interesting for us is, you know, how do the communists actually use it, and where does it work, when does it not work? You know, when do these concepts of enmity also become discredited? Because I think if you look at something, and that's my last point, like Lipsky's famous essay about patriotism, then the dissidents by the 1970s have understood already that these whole concepts of enmity that the communist system is throwing around, that they're actually quite discredited, and that they're, you know, they're not leading anywhere anymore. They're sort of become ridiculous, and nobody believes in them anymore. Thanks.
Do you want to react now, or shall we collect some more?
Well, briefly, this 1939-1956 comparison, that's something that has interested me as well, also because what is in the history, especially in the history of communist intellectuals, very important is this moment of illusion and disillusion. And obviously we might say 1956, I would say it's really the biggest one, but the first one comes with 1939, where there is already the first wave of the idea of disillusionment that we see then in the memoirs of the communists. So for me it is a useful comparison. I still think that 1939, 1941, 1945, still in final analysis, it's again very simplified, creates clarity, especially for East Central Europeans, East Central European communists. For sometimes it creates clarity, even though, as you said, with the Germans, with the Hungarians, 1947 is different from 1949. It changes all the time. But I would say, and I, you know, connecting the question of what you said about it's nothing new in post-Stalinism, there were questions and lack of clarity already before. I would say the difference really is very simple, that Stalin still, I would say, until very end, remained in major issues of ideology this master editor. And that was a clarity, so to speak, in the local or in the national
party leaderships that simply waited what was going to be said in Moscow. After 53 and even more 56, this outside authority is gone. And there is a much more, I would say, authentic political language. Authentic in the sense of uncertainty. I understand authenticity in political language generally as this questioning way of discourse, that this massive accumulation of questions. And I think, but that one would have to look at more clearly at the sources. I looked at for post-Stalinism also for 40s and 50s. I looked at only very briefly for this comparison. But I don't think that you would find, I didn't find such files like this in 1951. And I looked at quite a lot of them in Warsaw, in Prague, in Berlin. I compared 3 countries. There were no minutes like this. They were like this, very structured, very boring, very kind of it was less paper. No, but this materiality tells you as a historian, obviously, where there is something that resonates. So, but again, I mean, you know the communist archives. It's huge. There is nothing like representativity at all. So for these 2 questions, and what specifically communist, I think in this context it's really important, and that's the argument of this Norwegian historian. It's not a novel argument, I'm sure, but this idea of the anti-imperialist conspiracy is something overarching, and Zionism / anti-Semitism as something that rather fits into, I think, is one of specificities of communist anti-Semitism, that there is always this Marxist language. And it also concerns not only anti-Semitism, but for instance Polish nationalism within the party in the 60s, where you expect completely nationalism, and what you see in the local archives is Marxism-Leninism with some national flavor. But still, this is the last one, very banal, one should not underestimate the ideology. Not only in Stalin's mind, even though there is such a huge debate only at one head, but also on this rank and file.
Misha.
Marxism-Leninism.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Marxism-Leninism. Yes. Oh, sorry. Marxism-Leninism. The question of working class. The question of classic, communist concepts.
Misha is next.
So, Pavel, thanks. Listening to you, I was feeling simultaneously inspired and frustrated, and I've been trying to figure out why exactly. And obviously, I always come to this from a Soviet angle. And I think maybe a way to sort of resolve my conflicted feelings is to think of the very interesting framework that you're proposing as a matter of maybe not a radical shift, but a strong change in emphasis. So the way I find your framework confirmed in the post-Stalin era is that I can think of lots of examples where people are making a distinction between an ideology that they're hating, let's say German revisionism under Adenauer, and individual people, because even if you're very hateful of German revisionism, that doesn't necessarily mean that you harbor any hostile feelings against individual West Germans.
Yes.
Right? And the other wonderful example, of course, is what Chuck and others have described as STO, right?
Yes.
Which is this over-identification with the enemy, and that is something that I think you can find examples of in the Stalinist period. Sheila Fitzpatrick talks about examples from the 30s where, boys are playing Nazis, basically just to provoke the grown-ups. But it's of course something that becomes much, much stronger in the post-Stalinist period, where we have this. Everybody knows these famous spy films. In each one of our countries in the Soviet Union would be 17 Moments in Spring, where the most dashing actors portray basically Nazi generals, and then everybody dresses up like that or tries to kind of somehow be like them, but also
Yes.
huge room.
Yes, yes.
It's gigantic, right? Starting, I mean, it was a huge undercurrent in what Itzhak Rudin has called the politics of culture, but then starting in 87 with the first public appearance of primates on Manir Square in Moscow, it becomes one of the big topics that's discussed in the informal movement and in the perestroika. But that's maybe, a kind of Soviet specificity compared to Central Europe. But no, going back to the Stalin era. So first of all, of course, enemies were often individualized, but they were also described ideologically, and I think they were often described ideologically with labels such as left deviationism, right deviationism, etc. And I'm wondering, in this context, what you think of Yigal Khalfin's work on Stalinism, the early Stalinism, the 20s, and even the predecessors to Stalinism, which he interprets not so much in Schmittian terms, but through what he calls the black mass metaphor, where the worst enemies are not Schmidt's sort of complete outsiders that you want to crush to death because they represent the exact opposite pole of what you are, but in fact the worst enemies that you want to get rid of are the parts of your own group who have sort of the inner knowledge of your practices, your ideology, etc., but now are becoming schismatics. The Trotskyists, the deviationists, the ethnic groups inside the country that are suspected of treason, etc. Which is, I mean, you can see the difference, right, between this and the sort of the Schmittian interpretation. So, and I think that in both periods you can find examples of what you have described as characteristic of the other period. Although if we take your framework as a matter of emphasis, I agree with you. But really, I wonder to what extent, maybe it's just my aversion to anything Schmittian, but to what extent do you think we really have to go as far as where Schmitt wants to take us?
Susan would be next. Or has that been taken up?
Well, no, it has been taken. Michal's question is more important, but this was just a request to have you go on a little bit about your claim that the most persecuted group of people was the working class. Pardon?
Percentage of arrests.
Yes. I mean, this is. May I start with that? Especially I think Marcin Zaremba, I think, worked on that among others, but other Polish social historians. For the Czechoslovak context, Petr Hojmos, German historian, made this statistics also in persecution way until 1960s. And I think if we would put together the statistics from the entire history of the communism, clearly we were working class that suffered most, not by shortage, etc., but I mean direct political persecution. And that's I can say that for Polish and Czechoslovak case, I'm not sure for the GDR, but I think given that the only uprising in the GDR or only formal protest was 1953, I think it's absolutely clear that these arrested workers outnumbered these couple of dissidents in the 70s and 80s.
And for the Soviet Union as well?
I don't know. I would say that would be definitely the case as well.
Yeah.
But also peasants, like millions of peasants deported in 1952. Question, but it comes.
Yes. Okay.
Katarina? I think you want to respond.
No,
to Misha in a
let's say
minute.
cut it.
Thank you. I also would like to react to mention what I have said, and I
Sorry.
this was a little bit caricature, but I have for you during the copy praise.
It was unfair. I'm sorry.
But because I think it's if I may very quickly say what I think is the difference between Czechoslovakia and Poland, the anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic campaign is that really the timing matters in the sense that in Czechoslovakia it was bound to this Stalinist or supposedly only Stalinist trial. So this is why by criticizing the trial
Yes, I'm sorry for that. I didn't want to, make a caricature out of that. But I will come back to Misha in a while. But this is just a brief answer for that. I think it's still interesting and sort of untersuchungswert that this language of anti-Semitism was a powerful in the Prague Spring, and that it really even arrived into the main document in such a way. I think there is something we can look at the background of how these party documents were made. I mean, there are also now stories in the memoirs who wrote which part of the action program, what wrote Zdeněk Mlynář, what the others. So this is an interesting, that would be a kind of invitation into a deeper, also institutional analysis of the inner workings of this anti-Semitism and why it really became so important. This argument about Martin Schulze-Wessel's argument about the early critical coming to terms of the Czechs with the Holocaust memory and remembrance since the 60s. I mean, it's always easy to take a couple of beautiful books and beautiful movies and say, I mean, they were powerful, no way, and they as artistic captivation of these issues, so captivating. But it's an open question whether it suffices to answer such a big issue. And Stjop, well, there is a lot of funny moments in these archives, and the quotes, a lot of quotations that are much more funny than this Tito Stoporen, and especially in Czech archives, as you might think, there is a lot of. And I thought sometimes that reading the minutes and reading the narratives of some people, for instance, especially when they talk about first person, which is very often the case after 1956, when people do not understand what is happening. So they in the party meetings, they narrate their life stories, why they became communists, why they, etc., etc. Sometimes very long, and sometimes you think it's very authentic in the way that there is no kind of irony. But with the time, sometimes you have the feeling that there is this reproduction of this hyper-normalization of language. I would argue that in the 50s, late 50s and then the 60s, this questioning form of discourse still prevails. And then in the meetings, and then we don't have this sort of automatic kind of responses and answers. I mean, in Polish party archives, they had there was a beautiful institutions in the party meetings or after or connected with the party meetings. Wieczory pytań I odpowiedzi, and some of them are kept in the archives, and that's one of the most wonderful sources historian can really come across. But really Stjop in this party milieu, I haven't found it, because you have to have a really one story, one kind of case with a person that try to place with the organs. And Schmidt, whether we need it, I don't. Yeah. I think my point was really this idea of violence. That it's less quoted and less known than this division, but the idea of that enmity starts and ends with violence. I think it is a useful, let's say, remark for the history of the regimes, even though we work on the peaceful periods, 60s, 70s and 80s, and even if we want to explain the peaceful revolution, precisely the absence of violence is the question we should ask. 89 in most of the countries, not all, of course. Yes?
Can I sort of barge in with one last question? If there are no more from the floor, I'll abuse my position at the microphone. I know you're looking at party meetings or archival material from party meetings, but I would like to tempt you to think on a grander scale. may it not be just the sign of the times? If you think about the United States at the very period we're talking about, McCarthyism and the end thereof, that there's something, I know that's not very historical, but there's something in the air.
It's very historical.
Yeah. And the second point I'd like to, this is more just an inquiry, I recollect that in the archives you can read, in party files, you can read a lot in the 50s and perhaps even more so in the 60s in the GDR, that they are obsessed with the question which stage of the revolution they have reached.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you say you shouldn't discount ideology on Marxist-Leninism too quickly, maybe this debate is also significant in the sense that they try to convey to party members that there was a certain stage of the revolutionary society reached that no longer needed enemies, because it was a phase of consolidation. That was more wishful thinking, I guess, but it was obsessively discussed.
Which stage of revolution was one of the most frequent questions after 1956, and that is that it comes really only after 1956. And what was then before? What was the time 48 to 53 and 56? What was the time? Then, retrospectively, the questions to 39 and 41 return, so to speak. So this is, I think, really a complete novelty of post-Stalinist this sort of this lack of clarity in terms of time. And what time is it, really? Sort of, in what stage are we at the very moment? That's one of the most frequent questions.
And if you even posit that you have reached a stage of, say, consolidation or maturity, or however they named it, then you probably are ill-advised to make a great spectre of enemies around you, so that might be threatened, or within.
Well, the problem is slightly that then even in the peaceful 60s, these questions of where are we now, they crop up especially in context of economic reforms, and economic reforms mostly crop up in context of economic crisis. So there is this idea of crisis of the socialist economy in German and Czech case in the beginning of the 60s. That's the sort of heyday of these questions of time and revolution. In German discourse, it's die Etappe. Die Etappe. Welche Etappe sind wir jetzt eigentlich? And very briefly, McCarthyism, anti-communism. Actually, it's pity, but I skipped that for lack of time. I prepared also a small passage on anti-communism in the West that actually very interestingly went through very similar transformation through Stalinism, Khrushchev era, and 60s, 1970s. And there are wonderful also social and cultural histories of anti-communism in the West in the meantime. And I think that would be an interesting undertaking as well, to put these.
Then I'd like you all to join me in thanking Pavel.
Thank you very much.
And we proceed downstairs. Are we going downstairs for a glass of wine? Or? I think so. Okay.